The chamber of the Galactic Council was a place where voices never stopped echoing, where representatives of dozens of species argued about trade routes, border disputes, and peace treaties. But on that day, a silence so heavy it felt unnatural spread across the Grand Hall. It began with a single report delivered by a trembling envoy whose species was known for calm logic and clear words. His voice cracked as he read out the latest intelligence. Humanity had mobilized its fleets. Earth's warships were not preparing to defend their colonies as many had expected. No, they were moving forward. They were marching into war. For a moment, the towering chamber, filled with alien colors and languages, froze. Ancient beings who had lived through centuries of galactic politics sat frozen in disbelief. The humans had always been considered reckless. Yes. They were bold, sometimes foolish, but also strangely clever. Yet no one had expected them to challenge an empire so vast, so powerful, that entire civilizations had bowed without firing a shot. The empire had crushed rebellions, starved out resistance, and erased planets from maps. And now humanity had chosen to fight them. An old delegate with scaled skin leaned forward, his voice low but trembling. "They are going to destroy themselves," he muttered. Round him, whispers rose. Some agreed, nodding quickly, their faces pale or their antennae shaking. Others shook their heads in wonder, murmuring that perhaps the humans were braver than they had thought. The council had never seen a species so young, so unprepared, take such a step. The chamber's high chancellor, a tall figure with eyes like pools of silver, raised a hand to quiet the voices. "Silence," he commanded, and his voice carried through the stone and light of the council chamber. "You say the humans march into war. Why?" His question was sharp, directed at the envoy who had delivered the message. The envoy swallowed, his pale lips trembling. "Because they refused to kneel," he said. "Their colonies were attacked on the frontier. Their people were killed. The empire demanded their surrender, but instead of bowing, they prepared for war. And now their fleets moved toward the enemy." A gasp swept the chamber. The delegates could picture its human fleets, crude by the standards of older civilizations, yet somehow dangerous in their unpredictability. Small frigates, fast corvettes, heavy cruisers, each ship commanded by men and women whose names no one in that chamber yet knew. Ordinary humans with extraordinary determination. The aliens whispered, their voices filled with disbelief. "Fools," muttered one, "children playing with fire." "Madness," said another. "They will be ashes within a year." But then a third voice, softer, broke through. "Or perhaps they will win." The chamber turned toward the speaker, an old representative whose people had once fought the same empire and lost everything. He leaned on his cane, his body frail, but his eyes burned with memory. "Do not forget what humans are," he said. "We watched them rise. We watched them survive on a world that was chaos. Deathworlders, they are called. And Deathworlders do not break. They adapt, they fight, they endure." The silence deepened, and a weight settled in the air. The truth of those words cut through the doubt. Humanity had always been underestimated. Many had laughed when humans joined the council. They were considered fragile, too emotional, too impulsive. But now, with their fleets moving, no one was. Laughing, the chamber felt cold. In distant space, at that very moment, warships left Earth's orbit. Commanders stood on their bridges, their faces lit by the glow of starfields. Ordinary men and women with names like Daniel Ross, Laura Morgan, Ethan Cole, names the galaxy did not yet know, but would soon remember. They had left their homes, their families, everything they loved, to face an enemy that had crushed civilizations far older than theirs. The council members did not see it. But in their minds, they could imagine the engines blazing, the steel hulls glinting in starlight, the banners of Earth painted across their ships. Humanity was not just defending itself. Humanity was marching forward. Back in the council chamber, panic rippled through the delegates. Some demanded that action be taken. We must stop them. One cried, "If they bring war into our territories, we all pay the price." Others argued, "No, let them fight. Let them burn. It will teach them a lesson." The chancellor listened to all of it, his face unreadable. Deep inside, however, he felt the same unease that everyone else did. This was not simply another conflict. This was a spark. And sparks had a way of becoming flames that spread across galaxies. The Council had always believed that power lay in numbers, in ancient fleets, in long histories of conquest and rule. But as they sat there, stunned and uncertain, the truth began to dawn. Power also lay in something harder to measure, in spirit, in will, in the refusal to kneel. And that was what the humans carried with them into the void. When the meeting finally broke, the delegates filed out of the chamber with heavy steps. Some whispered predictions of Earth's destruction. Others, more cautious, admitted that perhaps they had underestimated the humans. Perhaps this war would not end the way they expected. The council chamber, once filled with the noise of argument and debate, now echoed with silence, and in that silence, one truth settled deep in their hearts. Humanity had chosen war, and the galaxy would never be the same again above the red surface of Mars. The warship Horizon floated like a steel predator waiting to strike. Inside its command bridge, Commander Daniel Ross stood tall, his eyes fixed on the vast blackness of space. The crew around him sat in silence, every hand ready, every eye on him. They all knew what was coming. The order had been clear from Earth. Command: humanity would not wait for the enemy to crush their colonies again. They would strike first. The crew could feel the weight of that decision. Everyone on the bridge understood the danger. The enemy was stronger, older, and larger. Their fleets had swallowed empires and forced proud civilizations to their knees. Humanity had no allies in this war, no secret promise of rescue. They only had themselves, their machines, and the fire in their hearts. Yet none of the men and women aboard Horizon spoke of fear. They only waited for Ross to give the word. A low hum filled the bridge as warning lights glowed red. The sensor officer raised her head. "Contact," she said, her voice steady but tight. Multiple vessels entering from hyperspace, bearing 317. A pause, then she added, "Enemy frigates. At least a dozen." The screen lit up, showing the alien ships sliding into the system like silent sharks. Their hulls gleamed with strange alloys, curved and polished, designed for speed and precision. These frigates were not here to scout. They were hunters, sent to cut humanity's throat before the war had even begun. Ross clenched his jaw. He had studied the enemy for months, learning their tactics, their arrogance. He knew they expected humans to hesitate, to delay, to hide. But hesitation was death. He turned his eyes to his crew. "Target the lead ship," he ordered. "Load railguns. Charge plasma batteries. Fighters to launch status." The words were calm, but they sent a surge of electricity through the crew. Engineers in the lower decks ran to stations, locking in ammunition. Pilots strapped themselves into cockpits, their hands trembling only for a moment before instinct took over. The Horizon's engines burned brighter, pushing the ship into attack. "Position, railguns locked," the weapons officer called. "Fighters ready for launch," came another voice. "All systems green," the navigator confirmed. Ross gave a single nod. His hand hovered for just a heartbeat, knowing history would remember this moment. Then he spoke. "Fire." The Horizon shuddered as the railguns discharged. Slugs of dense metal, accelerated to unimaginable speed, tore through the void. They struck the lead frigate before its shields could fully rise. Sparks and fire blossomed from its hull as pieces of alien steel drifted into nothing. The first kill of the war belonged to humanity. The enemy answered at once. Blue plasma streaks lit the darkness, raining down on Horizon and its escorts. The shields rippled, alarms blared, and the deck shook under Ross's boots. Yet the human warship did not falter. "Return fire," he commanded. Plasma lances shot out from Horizon's sides, ripping through another frigate's engines. The void filled with chaos fighters weaving between exploding ships. Missiles chasing their targets like hunting dogs, railgun rounds slicing space. With deadly accuracy in the midst of the battle, Ross stood steady. His crew looked to him, and he gave them what they needed. Certainty. He reminded them of what was at stake. Earth was watching. Colonies on the frontier depended on them. Families back home prayed that someone, anyone, could stop the invaders. They had no choice but to fight. As the minutes dragged into hours, the battle grew bloodier. Human ships were scarred, some destroyed, but they did not retreat. A destroyer, named Falcon, rammed itself into an enemy cruiser, its captain shouting one final oath before the ship became a blazing comet. Fighters, outnumbered and outgunned, still darted forward, tearing holes in frigates that should have been invincible. Every loss was a wound, but every strike reminded the enemy that humans would never bend. On the bridge of Horizon, the weapons. Officer shouted, "Another frigate down." Cheers erupted for a heartbeat before the reality of battle swallowed them again. The crew was exhausted, drenched in sweat, yet their eyes burned with the same fire Ross carried in his chest. At last, the surviving alien frigates broke formation. Their sleek vessels turned, fleeing toward hyperspace. It was not a full retreat. They would return with more ships. Larger fleets, but for the first time humanity had forced them back. The void was littered with burning wreckage, twisted steel, and drifting bodies. Humanity had paid in blood, but the enemy had learned a lesson. Earth would not cower. Ross stood in silence, staring at the fading trails of the retreating enemy. His fists clenched behind his back, not in anger, but in resolve. Around him, the bridge crew sat stunned, realizing what they had done. The first shot had been fired. The first battle fought. Humanity had declared war not with words, but with steel and fire. He finally spoke, his voice low but carrying across the room. "Send a message to Earth Command. Report our victory. And tell them." He paused, his eyes narrowing. "Tell them humanity has entered the war." The crew erupted in tired cheers, voices cracking but hearts unbroken. Outside the Horizon, drifted among the wreckage, its scars glowing red, its engines still burning. It had survived. Humanity had survived. And though the enemy would return with greater force, they would never forget this day, the day the humans struck first. On the frontier planet of Elysia, the sky was no longer blue. It was filled with fire. Enemy warships hovered high above the atmosphere, their massive forms blocking out the light of the twin suns. From their underbellies, streams of plasma bombs fell toward the surface, painting trails of destruction as they rained down. The ground shook with every impact. Buildings crumbled, forests burned. And the once thriving colony world became a battlefield. In the middle of this chaos, Captain Laura Morgan led her Marines through the streets of the capital city. She was covered in dust and ash, her armor scorched by near misses, her voice carried above the screams of terrified civilians as she shouted orders. "Keep moving. Get them to the shuttles." Families ran past her, clutching their children, their eyes wide with fear. Laura and her soldiers formed a wall between the civilians and the oncoming enemy troops that had landed outside the city. The enemy soldiers were tall, armored in gleaming black plating that reflected the burning sky. They marched in silence, firing energy rifles that cut through walls and vehicles alike. Each step they took left the ground scorched. They were relentless, and yet Laura refused to let them break her people. She lifted her rifle and fired down the street. Her Marines followed, unleashing a hail of bullets and plasma grenades. The sound of battle roared through the narrow streets, echoing against the stone and steel of broken buildings. Alien soldiers fell, their armor sparking and cracking under the assault. But for every one that fell, another seemed to step forward. Behind Laura, a young boy stumbled, clutching his mother's hand. His face was streaked with dirt and tears. Laura bent low, lifting him into her arms without hesitation. She pushed him into the hands of a medic who was guiding civilians toward the evacuation point. "Get him out of here," she barked, before turning back to face the enemy. Explosions rocked the ground. A tower collapsed nearby, its shadow swallowing an entire street. The Marines barely had time to drag survivors out before the debris crushed everything in sight. Dust filled the air, choking lungs, but still the humans fought. Overhead, the battle in space raged just as fiercely. Human destroyers and cruisers struggled against the enemy fleet, their smaller numbers forcing them into desperate maneuvers. Every time a human ship fell, its fireball lit the sky above Elysia, and the colonists below cried out in despair. But then, when all seemed lost, another human warship would descend, blasting enemy fighters out of the atmosphere with furious barrages. Laura heard the voice of Commander Ethan Cole crackle through her comms. "Ground team, hold your position. Reinforcements are en route. Buy us time." His voice was sharp, filled with urgency. "Understood," Laura replied, her tone steady despite the storm around her. She raised her rifle again, her Marines rallying to her side. They knew the odds were against them, but they also knew that retreat meant death for the civilians they had sworn to protect. The fight turned into brutal street-to-street combat. Marines fought from windows, rooftops, and barricades. Every corner of the city became a battleground. Civilians hid in basements, praying for rescue, while human soldiers spilled blood to hold back the tide. At one point, Laura found herself face to face with one of the alien commanders. The creature towered over her, its armor glowing with crimson light. It roared, swinging a massive blade down at her. She rolled aside, the weapon carving a deep scar into the pavement. With a shout, she fired her rifle point blank, the rounds piercing the cracks in its armor. The alien fell, and her Marines cheered, their courage renewed. But the cost was high. Dozens of human soldiers lay broken in the streets. Smoke rose from shattered vehicles. The city itself seemed to cry out in agony. Still, the humans fought on, refusing to yield at the evacuation site. Shuttles roared as they lifted into the sky, carrying civilians to orbiting transports. Each shuttle that escaped was a victory, even as enemy fire tried to swat them from the air. Laura stood guard at the final shuttle, her armor dented and bloodied, her rifle nearly empty. She watched as mothers and children climbed aboard, their faces pale but grateful. As the shuttle doors closed, she turned back toward the battlefield. The enemy was still coming, wave after wave. But Laura smiled grimly. They had bought enough time. The civilians were safe, for now. That was all that mattered. High above, in the darkness of space, the war raged on. Human warships continued to bleed, their crews dying in silence. But their sacrifices gave hope. For every city destroyed, for every colony burned, humanity grew more determined. What the enemy did not understand was that these attacks did not weaken the humans. They only fueled their fury. As the last shuttle lifted off, Laura raised her rifle again, her Marines forming a final line beside her. The city around them was gone, turned into fire and ash. but the humans still stood. She whispered to herself, barely audible beneath the roar of war, "You will never break us." And in that moment, though the enemy pressed harder and the galaxy thought humanity was doomed, the truth was clear. The humans were not broken. They were only just beginning to fight. On the surface of the moon, the great domes of the defense base glowed faintly under the harsh light of the distant sun. Inside those domes, behind walls of steel and concrete, the high command of humanity gathered. Admirals, generals, engineers, and strategists filled a long chamber that overlooked the craters and the cold stars beyond. The war had already begun, and it had already bled humanity. Reports from Elysia, from the colonies, and from the outer fleets lay scattered across the table. Every page told the same story, lasses. Cities destroyed, soldiers killed, families gone. Yet not a single face in that room looked ready to surrender. Commander Daniel Ross, fresh from the victory at Mars orbit, stood at one end of the chamber. His uniform was burned and torn, a reminder of the battle. Across from him stood Captain Laura Morgan, who had barely escaped the fires of Elysia. The two exchanged a silent nod, not of celebration, but of recognition. They had seen the enemy's power. They had watched their people die. And they both understood what was now at stake. The chief admiral of the meeting, K, a tall man with gray streaks in his hair, slammed his hand against the table. "We face an empire that outnumbers us 10-1, he said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "They have fleets larger than our entire navy. They have crushed civilizations older than ours. And yet, we are still here, still breathing, still fighting. Why?" The room went quiet. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Laura stepped forward. "Because we do not kneel," she said simply. Her voice carried through the chamber, steady and sharp. "They thought Elysia would break us. They thought burning our homes would make us surrender. But it only made us stronger." A murmur of agreement rippled through the officers. Some clenched their fists, others nodded with grim approval. The humans had lost, yes, but in every loss, there was also proof of their resilience. Engineers stepped forward next, their eyes burning with determination. They spoke of new projects, weapons born from desperation. In secret hangars beneath the lunar surface, massive dreadnoughts were being assembled. These ships were larger, heavier, and more dangerous than anything humanity had built before. They were given names meant to inspire liberty, independence, defiance. These names would carry across the stars like banners of war. One young scientist, his hands shaking from lack of sleep, presented designs for a new railgun that could pierce even the thickest enemy hulls. Another revealed a stealth system meant 2 masked ships from alien sensors. Every plan was daring, every idea born from the understanding that survival was no longer enough. Humanity would not simply survive this war. Humanity would win it. The admirals laid out strategies, their voices steady, though their eyes betrayed their worry. They spoke of choke points like Orion's Gate, of ambushes near asteroid belts, of defending Earth itself at all costs. Maps lit up with red and blue lights, marking battles yet to come. Every officer knew that most of those battles would end in fire, but none dared to suggest surrender. Ross finally stood, his voice carrying calm authority. "We cannot fight them ship for ship. We cannot match their numbers. But we can match their will. Every man and woman who stands on our ships fights for their home, for their family, for Earth. The enemy fights for conquest. We fight for survival. And that is why we will not lose." The words echoed through the chamber. Silence followed, then applause, not the applause of celebration, but the applause of soldiers who knew they were walking into hell and were ready to do it anyway. Outside the domes, in the vast hangars carved into the lunar rock, crews worked day and night. Sparks showered as welders pieced together the skeletons of new ships. Engines roared as test flights shook the dust of the moon. Young pilots, barely out of training, strapped into simulators, their eyes sharp with determination. They knew they might not live long, but they also knew their fight would inspire those who came after. On Earth itself, families gathered around screens to watch the news. They saw images of Horizon, of Laura Morgan's Marines, of civilians rescued from burning colonies. They mourned their dead, but they also whispered promises to keep fighting. Children drew pictures of starships, naming them after heroes they had never met. Entire cities volunteered resources, pouring everything they had into the war effort. Humanity, for all its flaws, had never been so united. Back in the lunar chamber, the meeting drew to a close. The plans were set. The fleets would gather, the new dreadnoughts would launch, and humanity would prepare to meet the Empire head-on. As the officers filed out, Ross and Laura remained for a moment, staring out at the stars beyond the glass. They don't believe. "We can win," Laura said softly, thinking of the Galactic Council, of the whispers that humanity would soon be ashes. Ross's eyes narrowed. "Then we'll prove them wrong." The stars outside the dome glittered like cold fire. The humans in that chamber knew the road ahead was drenched in blood, that more colonies would burn, that more soldiers would fall. But they also knew one thing with absolute certainty. Humanity was not preparing to die. Humanity was preparing to fight, and in that moment, the galaxy had no idea how dangerous that resolve would become. The Orion's Gate was not a real gate. It was a narrow stretch of space, a choke point where trade routes and hyperspace lanes crossed like tangled rivers. Whoever controlled Orion's Gate controlled the flow of fleets across half the galaxy. And now, it was where humanity would make its stand. Commander Ethan Cole stood on the bridge of his cruiser. Vanguard, his hands gripping the railing as the stars stretched before him. Around him, dozens of human ships drifted into formation. Cruisers, destroyers, frigates, and carriers, all patched together from every corner of the human navy. Their hulls bore scars from previous battles, but their engines still burned bright. Cole knew their numbers were too few, their technology too new, and their crews too tired. Yet, none of that mattered now. They were humanity's shield, and they had to hold this line. "Enemy fleet detected," the sensor officer said. Her voice was steady, though her hands trembled on the console. "Over 100 vessels inbound. They'll be here in minutes." The bridge went quiet. The numbers were worse than anyone had hoped. 100 ships against less than 30. The alien fleet glided out of hyperspace like a wall of black steel, their warships shaped like blades of obsidian, their lights glowing with cold, unnatural precision. They moved with a predator's grace, confident that victory was already theirs. Cole looked at his officers. Fear showed in their eyes, but behind it was something stronger resolve. "Signal the fleet," he ordered. "We hold Orion's Gate. No retreat." The comm officer relayed the command. Cross the void. Human captains heard his words and prepared themselves. Pilots strapped into fighters, checking their weapons with shaking hands. Marines aboard troop transports locked rifles and whispered promises to fight to the last. Engineers in the engine rooms prayed to machines that were never meant to survive such a battle. Then the void erupted. The alien fleet fired first. Streams of blue plasma crossing the darkness like rivers of light. Human shields flared, shattering under the pressure, and smaller frigates exploded in brilliant fireballs. But even as the first human ships died, Cole's voice cut through the chaos. All ships returned fire. Railguns thundered, their slugs ripping through the void. Missiles streaked out, splitting into smaller warheads that tore into the enemy lines. Plasma lances burned white-hot as they carved into black hulls. The battle turned Orion's Gate into a storm of fire and steel. Human fighters swarmed out of carriers, darting between alien cruisers like hornets. They were fragile, their wings shattering under even a single hit, but the pilots flew with reckless courage. They fired missiles at close range, weaving between enemy cannons. Some even ramming their fighters into enemy engines when their weapons failed. Every pilot knew they would not live long, but their sacrifice bought precious seconds for the larger ships to strike. On the Vanguard, the ship shook as plasma fire slammed into its shields. Shields at 30%. An officer shouted. Cole braced himself, eyes locked on the tactical display. "Bring us closer," he ordered. "If we die in their faces." The Vanguard surged forward, leading a group of destroyers into the heart of the enemy fleet. Railguns blazed, tearing into a massive alien battleship. The enemy responded with crushing fire, one destroyer vanishing in an explosion so bright it blinded the crew for seconds. Still, the others pressed on, slashing through the enemy lines. Cole's heart pounded in his chest. He had never seen such destruction, never smelled so much fear in the air. And yet, when he looked at his crew, he saw no surrender. Even in the face of impossible odds, they fought. He thought of Earth, of families watching the skies, of children. Drawing pictures of warships in classrooms, they could not fail. Suddenly, the comms burst with static. Then a desperate voice. "This is the Falcon. We're going down, but we're taking them with us." Cole's eyes widened. Battered destroyer accelerated straight toward an enemy cruiser. Its engines flared, overloaded, as its captain shouted his final oath. A moment later, the Falcon struck, and the void exploded in a wave of fire. Both ships were gone, but the path they left open allowed human fighters to pour through. The battle dragged on, minute by brutal minute. Ships fell, both human and alien, until the stars themselves seemed to weep fire. The void filled with debris, with drifting bodies, with the shattered remains of dreams. And yet, somehow, the human fleet endured. They fought not with numbers, but with fury. Not with superiority, but with sheer will. Finally, the alien admiral, watching his forces break against the human line, hesitated. His ships were damaged. His losses greater than expected. The humans, though bloodied, refused to die. And in that hesitation, the tide shifted. Cole seized the moment. All ships pressed the attack. He roared. The humans surged forward, battered warships charging into the enemy ranks. Plasma fire lit the void. Missiles streaked like comets, and railguns thundered with unstoppable rage. For the first time, the aliens faltered. For the first time, they retreated. When the smoke cleared, Orion's Gate was littered with the wreckage of both fleets. Human ships drifted, burning and broken, but still alive. Cole leaned against the railing, his body aching with exhaustion. He looked around at his crew, at their wide eyes and shaking hands, and gave a single nod. They had held Orion's Gate against impossible odds. They had stood their ground. The galaxy would whisper of this day. The day humanity faced an empire's fury and did not bow. The day humanity showed that even in the darkest void, they would fight until the stars themselves went silent. The Battle of Orion's Gate had shaken the galaxy. Humanity had not only survived, but forced the enemy to retreat, and that truth spread across every star system like wildfire. Yet inside Earth's high command, the admirals and engineers knew one thing clearly: survival was not enough. They needed a weapon that would change everything, something so powerful that even the enemy, with all their centuries of conquest, would tremble when they saw it. That weapon had a name whispered in secret workshops under the lunar surface. It was called Liberty. The dreadnought Liberty was not just another ship. It was a monster of steel, twice the size of any human battleship, and its hull was layered, with armor so thick it could withstand direct plasma bombardments. Its heart was a new kind of engine, forged from technology humans had pushed to its limits. For months, engineers had worked in silence, living inside the hangars, eating and sleeping beside the unfinished giant. Sparks had showered from its frame, welders carving life into its bones. Every bolt, every wire, was placed with trembling hands and tired eyes. It was more than a ship, was the embodiment of Earth's defiance. Captain Laura Morgan was among the first to see it completed. She stood in the vast hangar, her boots echoing against the steel floor, staring up at the massive warship. "It doesn't look like it belongs to us," she whispered, awe in her voice. "It looks like it was made for gods." Beside her, Commander Daniel Ross smiled faintly, though his face showed the lines of exhaustion. "Then let's remind the galaxy that humans can be gods of war when we need to be." The Liberty's weapons were unlike anything seen before. Along its sides stretched colossal rail cannons, capable of punching holes straight through enemy battleships. Plasma lances lined its flanks, glowing with caged energy waiting to be unleashed. At its bow rested the Titan lance, a weapon so powerful it could fire a bolt of energy across thousands of kilometers, tearing through shields and armor alike. And hidden within its hangars were wings of fighters, faster and deadlier than any that had flown before. When the Liberty finally left its dock and slid into the void, every human ship in orbit stopped to watch. Pilots saluted from cockpits, engineers cried openly, and soldiers cheered. The dreadnought moved with the grace of a predator, its engines roaring softly, as though the very stars recognized something new had entered their domain. Its first trial would not be long in coming. Word spread quickly that the enemy was gathering near Vega, preparing to strike another colony. The human fleet, battered and thin from Orion's gate, could not hope to stop them alone. But with Liberty leading the charge, everything changed. The fleet assembled at Vega, a nervous collection of cruisers and destroyers standing guard over a trembling planet. Civilians had already begun evacuations, shuttles streaming into orbit, while soldiers dug trenches on the surface, ready to fight to the last. When the alien fleet arrived, it came in numbers so vast it seemed to blot out the stars. Enemy cruisers and battleships stretched across the void, their lights burning like cold fire. But then Liberty appeared. It slid from hyperspace at the head of the human fleet, its massive silhouette dwarfing every other ship. For a moment, even the enemy hesitated. Their comm channels buzzed with confusion. This was not the fragile fleet they had crushed before. This was something new, something terrifying. "Target locked," Liberty's weapons officer reported. The rail cannons hummed, the plasma lances glowed, and the Titan lance prepared its first charge. "Fire," Ross commanded. The Liberty roared. A railgun slug the size of a shuttle tore through space and smashed into an alien battleship, splitting it apart in a blinding explosion. Plasma lances fired next, cutting across the void like blades of fire, shredding smaller cruisers in half. Then the Titan lance unleashed its Furia beam of pure energy that carved through 3 ships in a single shot. Silence fell across the comm channels, followed only by the crackle of disbelief from alien captains who had never seen their mighty vessels fall so quickly. Human ships rallied behind Liberty, spirits ignited. Cruisers surged forward, destroyers darted into enemy formations, and fighters poured from Liberty's hangars like a swarm of hornets. For the first time, humanity did not fight only to survive, they fought to dominate. On the bridge of Liberty, Laura Morgan gripped the rail as the massive ship absorbed enemy fire that would have crippled any other vessel. Shields holding. The officer reported, those sparks flew from consoles as the enemy pounded them with everything they had. Ross stood firm. Keep firing. Show them what humanity is. Minutes turned into hours. The void around Vega transformed into a graveyard of burning wreckage. Enemy ships tried again and again to flank Liberty, but its weapons tore them apart. The dreadnought moved like a mountain through the storm, unstoppable and unyielding. Finally, the alien admiral gave the order to retreat. One by one, their ships turned, fleeing into hyperspace, leaving Vega in human hands. The battlefield was silent, except for the cheers of human crews, their voices echoing across the comms. Humanity had not only defended Vega, they had shattered the enemy's pride. News of Liberty's victory spread like wildfire across the galaxy. Worlds that had once dismissed humans now whispered of their power. Oppressed species under the Empire's heel began to dream of freedom again. And in the Galactic Council, delegates sat frozen. The same thought haunting them all. Humanity had created a weapon that could change the balance of the galaxy. On the Bridge of Liberty, Ross and Laura stood side by side, watching the wreckage drift among the stars. They were tired, battered, and scarred, but their eyes burned with the same fire. Humanity was no longer just defending itself. Humanity was marching forward, one battle at a time, and with Liberty leading the way, the war had only just begun. The name Liberty spread through the stars faster than light. Stories of the dreadnoughts' victory at Vega reached every world, carried on whispers, songs, and secret transmissions. Where once the galaxy thought humans were weak, now they spoke. The word human with a mix of fear and hope. And as Liberty drifted back to Earth for repairs, dozens of other ships were rising from hidden docks and secret shipyards. Humanity was no longer just defending. Humanity was marching. Commander Daniel Ross stood on the Bridge of Liberty as new warships streamed past in formation. Their hulls were fresh, their names painted boldly in white letters. Independence, Valor, Horizon, Triumph, Destiny. Each name carried meaning, a promise that humans would not stop until the war was won. Pilots cheered as their ships left dock. Engineers cried as they watched the creations of their hands roar into space. Entire colonies tuned in to the broadcasts, watching their fleets grow with pride, swelling in their hearts. Across the galaxy, oppressed worlds looked up at the sky and dared to believe in freedom again. On planets under the Empire's heel, whispers spread in shadowed taverns and broken streets. The humans fight back. The humans do not kneel. To those who had long lost hope, the humans became more than just a species. They became a symbol. The next great march began with the fleet gathering near the Soul Gate, a shimmering tunnel of hyperspace routes that led into enemy territory. From every colony, ships arrived, their hulls scarred but their spirits unbroken. Old freighters had been refitted into carriers. Civilian ships were converted into gunboats. Every resource humanity could spare was poured into the war effort. On the day of departure, the fleet stretched across the void, hundreds of ships standing ready. Families watched from Earth, waving at the skies, whispering prayers to loved ones aboard those vessels. Children clutched small flags, not knowing if they would ever see their parents again. But in their eyes burned the same fire, the belief that humanity would prevail. When the order came, the march began. Engines lit the darkness, thousands of thrusters burning like a second sun. The fleet surged forward into hyperspace, a storm of steel and determination. And at their head sailed Liberty, its massive silhouette like a guardian leading them into destiny. The first target was the system of Thalor, a mining world long used by the Empire to fuel its fleets. When the human armada emerged from hyperspace, the alien overseers mocked them at first, but laughter turned to screams as Liberty's Titan lance split their battleships in half. Valor's cruisers cut supply convoys to pieces. Independence led fighter squadrons that swarmed like fire through the skies. Within hours, Thaler was free. The miners, once beaten and broken, raised their fists in the air and shouted the name of humanity. The march did not stop. From Thaler, they struck the outposts of Arden, the garrisons of Crows, the shipyards of Vera. Each time, the Empire sent fleets to crush them. Each time, the humans fought with such fury that the enemy lines cracked. Even when human ships were lost in fire and silence, the march continued. Every battle made the humans stronger. Every victory pulled more people to their side. Inside the Galactic Council, fear grew. The delegates gathered in their great chamber, voices rising in panic. They should have been ashes by now. One shouted, "How are they still fighting?" Another answered with trembling words, "Because they do not fight as others do. They fight with something more. They fight as if every star depends on them." The council, once so certain that humanity would collapse, now whispered of the unthinkable. Perhaps the humans could actually win. On the front lines, Captain Laura Morgan commanded her Marines aboard the carrier Triumph. She fought ground battles, as fiercely as Ross commanded in space. Her soldiers stormed fortresses, tore down the enemy's banners, and raised Earth's colors high. Civilians embraced them, weeping, calling them liberators. And everywhere she went, she reminded her soldiers of the promise they carried. "We are not just fighting for Earth," she told them. "We are fighting for every world that cannot fight for itself." The march of the warships was not easy. Every victory came with loss. Ships like the Destiny and the Courage were torn apart in ambushes. Their crews gone, but their sacrifice remembered. Pilots wrote their names in fire across the skies, buying time for others to escape. Marines bled in trenches on alien soil, holding the line until reinforcements arrived. The humans buried their dead in foreign dirt, but every grave became a vow to keep fighting. Still, the Empire was vast, and its leaders grew desperate. They poured more fleets into the war, their admirals furious at the humiliation humans had dealt them. But the more they fought, the more they realized something terrifying. The humans were not breaking. They were only becoming stronger, harder, more relentless at last. After months of endless battles, the human fleet stood on the edge of enemy core space. Liberty, scarred but unbowed, led the armada. Around it, ships named Valor, Independence, Triumph, Horizon, and dozens more stood. Ready? Pilots strapped themselves into fighters. Marines kissed pictures of their families. And commanders prepared for the bloodiest battle yet. On the Bridge of Liberty. Ross looked at Laura across the comms, their faces hardened by fire and loss. "This is it," he said quietly. "This is where we decide the future." Laura nodded. "Then let's show them what humans are made of." And with that, the order was given. The fleet surged forward, their march shaking the galaxy. Humanity was no longer a question mark in the stars. Humanity was an answer, an unstoppable storm. And the Empire, for the first time in centuries, knew fear.